I met a very interesting person this week. This man's father was a conjoined twin, and he was explaining to me that his father's brother was his uncle on his father's side. Is that wrong? Then he went on to tell me, too, that another problem that he was having as a kid was his older brother was always tearing out the last couple of pages of his comic books. And, it really upset him. And so, all right, I'll come back to that joke in a minute because I can't think of the punchline. It really upset him because it forced him to draw his own conclusions. All right, that's enough. You didn't get that one, Kevin? You did. Okay, good. Enough brother jokes. Today we have a story of brothers. And they are older brothers that have done something wrong to Joseph. And in chapter 45, we kind of come to the climax of this story. Joseph, quickly, you remember, was his father's favorite son. And all his older brothers resented that fact. And so when Joseph came out to find his older brothers in the field, they grabbed him and they were going to kill him, but their conscience got the best of them. And instead they decided to sell him as a slave to some passing slave traders. And Joseph, of course, is taken by the slave traders to Egypt. And while in Egypt, he grows up and through the ranks of the Egyptian government until he is the second in charge behind only Pharaoh. And Pharaoh puts him in charge of everything during a time. His brothers come to Egypt during that time because they're starving and they need grain. And Joseph somehow sees them, recognizes who they are, but they don't know who he is. And he sets them up for a crime of theft. They didn't really do it, but he sets them up, and that way he can hold them there. And I'm sure while he's holding them there, he's wondering what he's going to do with these people who have wronged him so deeply in his life. And the brothers have no idea what's going on, why this powerful Egyptian is holding them and possibly going to execute them. And they're in fear. And finally, Joseph decides what he's going to do. He's going to forgive them. And so he calls them into his court. He dismisses his servants. And he tells them, I'm Joseph. I'm the brother you sold into slavery years ago. And then he forgives them. And in that moment, there is nothing but tears. Tears all around. And those tears are tears of healing. Those tears are tears of wholeness. Those tears are tears of reconciliation, and they're tears of growth. Joseph says, look, don't blame yourself for what you did to me all those years ago. It was a part of God's plan. We are all on the journey we're meant to be on. And I know that sentence is hard for some people to hear. If you've been through sexual abuse or physical abuse or emotional abuse or abandonment or serious illness or death of a loved one, you can't help but say, how can I possibly embrace that as a part of the journey that I'm meant to be on? You can, because it's made you who you are. The most painful hurts in your life have also given you gifts and strength in equal measure. the deep suffering and hurts you've received from other people or events or situations have actually given you strength and gifts of equal and opposite measure. They've made you who you are. They've either made you stronger or tougher or more compassionate or more creative, but they've given you a strength. The problem is you cannot unlock these new strengths that have grown out of the seeds of your suffering until you can move into forgiveness. Forgiveness is what sets that all free. That's why the central symbol of Christianity is a cross that represents forgiveness. We cannot live the life we were intended to fully live if we cannot forgive. All those gifts and blessings that have grown out of our suffering will not blossom and bring us joy until we can forgive. When we carry resentment and condemnation around, we can never get to that life fully lived that God's intended for us. You know, whenever I preach a sermon on forgiveness, I always go to this website called The Forgiveness Project. It has incredible stories, all of them true. It's worth you taking a look at sometime. And the one I saw this time was about a mother named Joan, whose 28-year-old son, James, happened to be in a bar one night, the same night that a young guy, 19 years old, named Jacob, and his gang were also in the bar. And a bit of a dust-up started happening between the members of Jane's gang and the Jacob's friends. And a fight broke out. And Jacob threw one punch. And that punch landed squarely on James. And it ended up causing a brain bleed. And a week later, James died in the hospital. And Jacob was sent off to prison. Jacob had already dropped out of high school. He was already drinking daily. And then he went to prison. And it didn't help him any. Joan, the mother, in the meantime, was filled not only with grief, but bitterness, because Jacob's sentence was only for 13 months. And she thought that was a pathetically light sentence, and she was filled with resentment. Ironically, in prison, Jacob felt like a victim. He felt like he had thrown only one punch, and now he was in jail. He felt like his friends, who he had thought were the most important things in his life, his gang, had fingered him, had told on him, and abandoned him. And he said, all this wrong thinking I had about being a victim wasn't helped in prison, because he said everybody around me thought the same thing, that they were victims. They were the victim. So after his 13 months, Jacob got out, and his life was absolutely no different. He was miserable. And he just was in worse misery. Not working, drinking, flopping at relatives' homes. In the meantime, Joan was continuing to carry this burden of resentment, until she was approached by a group that tries to foment reconciliation between perpetrators and victims. And they said, would you like to send Jacob a letter? And she said, I would. And Jacob said one day he receives this letter from Joan asking him, what happened that night? Why did you throw that punch? And telling him what her life had been like for the past 13 months. Jacob said that was the first time he ever realized that someone else's life was suffering worse than his because of what happened that night. He said, I was just blind to it. And they began exchanging letters. And as Jacob saw empathy growing in him, guess what else began to grow? He began to live his life. First, he got the first job he'd ever had in a warehouse. Soon he got what is the equivalent of a GED in England. Meanwhile, Joan in these letters is finding her resentment is lessening and lightening. And she is beginning to encourage Jacob. So much so that Jacob enters college. He applies and is accepted. 2.5 years had passed, and they agreed it was time they could meet face to face. And so the organization that had put them together set up an in-person meeting. And Jacob said the hardest thing he had ever done in his life was to walk through that door where Joan was sitting. But when he walked into that room and sat across from her, you know what happened? Exactly what happened with Joseph and his brothers. They broke into tears and they shared. And when they left that day, they left no longer carrying a burden. Joan said she felt lighter than she ever had. And Jacob was committed to making the world and other people's lives a better place. Things he never thought could happen. New life that grew that he never thought could grow within him. And it all happened because of forgiveness. It allowed the strengths they had been building throughout their life from all the hurts and pains to blossom into life-changing, life-affirming events where they were living life to the fullest. You know, whenever we hold resentment towards another human being, we are in a cosmic attachment with them. We cannot stop being attached to them. And it stifles and it holds down all the gifts, all the strengths that we have accumulated because of our pain in life, because of the wrongs we've felt. The minute we begin to let that go, we begin to grow. And some people say, you know what, these things are too heavy. I just can't forgive it. And I understand that. Some of you have been through hurts that are way outside of my experience, and they're so deep. But you don't have to get there immediately. All you have to do is be willing to try. If you will yourself, if you will ask God daily, help me to forgive this wrong that was done to me, the change begins then. You don't have to be all the way there. You just have to be willing to come with us other broken people and try. And ask God to help you get there. And that moment, your life will open. Your gifts, your talents, your abilities will begin to grow. And it's all because of forgiveness. That's why the cross is at the heart of what we preach. Amen.